My name is Jake Matthews, and I'm 35 years old. This happened in September last year when I thought a weekend getaway in the mountains of Colorado might fix some cracks that had been forming in my life. Instead, it left me with cracks I can't repair, no matter how far I run. The plan was simple, an RV road trip with my girlfriend Mara and my best friend Sam. We'd been drifting apart, all of us. Mara, 32, was an insatiably curious history buff, obsessed with ghost towns. Sam, 33, was freshly divorced and bitter, masking his pain with sarcasm. And me? I was the glue trying to hold it all together, even though I'd been breaking under the weight of my own regrets for years. Mara suggested we visit Animas Forks, a crumbling mining town near Silverton, high in the San Juan Mountains. She claimed it was a photographer's dream, steeped in eerie history. I wasn't convinced, but Sam rolled his eyes and said, "Why not? Maybe we'll see some ghosts and finally get something interesting out of this trip." We arrived late in the afternoon, the sun casting long shadows over the jagged peaks. The dirt road had taken its toll on the RV, and as we pulled into the makeshift parking area near the town, the engine sputtered and died. "Great," Sam muttered, slamming his door. Stranded in the middle of nowhere with ghosts. Just my luck. Mara ignored him, grabbing her camera and marching toward the ruins. I followed her, hoping to salvage the trip. Sam trailed behind, muttering curses. The ghost town was unsettling in its emptiness. Wooden buildings leaned against time, their windows like hollow eyes. The wind howled through the skeletons of what was once a bustling mining community. Mara clicked away with her camera, enraptured. "This place is amazing," she said, her voice too loud in the stillness. We didn't notice the whispers at first. They were faint, like the wind slipping through cracks in the wood. But as the sun dipped below the mountains, they grew louder. "Did you hear that?" Mara asked, lowering her camera. "Hear what?" Sam replied, lighting a cigarette. "The voices, they sound close." Sam snorted. "It's the wind, Mara. Don't go turning this into some ghost hunting crap." But I heard them too. Soft, overlapping murmurs. They didn't sound like wind. Back at the RV, Sam's mood soured further when the engine refused to start. I tinkered with it until my hands were black with grease, but nothing worked. Mara cooked dinner on the portable stove while Sam paced, grumbling. Then the birds came. A flock of crows crashed into the RV, one after another, their bodies slamming against the windows. Mara screamed, dropping the pan she'd been holding. "What the hell?" Sam shouted, grabbing a flashlight. The crows were gone as quickly as they'd arrived, leaving bloody smears on the glass. "It's just wildlife," I said, trying to keep calm, though my heart was pounding. That night, I couldn't sleep. The whispers were back, louder now, wrapping around the RV like a living thing. I peeked out the window and saw movement near the saloon at the center of the ghost town. A shadow, tall, impossibly thin, slipped between the ruins. "Mara, wake up," I whispered, shaking her shoulder. She stirred, groggy. "What's wrong?" "There's someone out there." She grabbed her camera, her curiosity outweighing her fear. Sam joined us reluctantly, muttering, "If this is some prank, I'm going to kill you both." We ventured into the ruins, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The whispers grew louder, circling us. "Is anyone there?" Mara called, her voice trembling. A child's laughter answered her. I froze. It sounded close, but there was no one. Just shadows. "This is messed up," Sam said, backing toward the RV. "I'm done. You two can play Ghostbusters." The descent into chaos. The next morning, Sam was different. He was pale, his eyes sunken, and he snapped at everything we said. Did you sleep at all? I asked. Not with your damn ghost stories in my head, he muttered. Mara, unfazed, was determined to explore more. There's something here, Jake. I can feel it. Let me take a few more shots, and then we'll leave. I should have stopped her. Instead, I let her go, thinking I'd keep an eye on Sam. That's when he heard it, the voice. Sam froze mid-argument, his face turning white. What's wrong? I asked. He pointed toward the saloon. I heard her, my ex-wife. She called my name. That's impossible, I said. But the fear in his eyes was undeniable. He bolted toward the saloon. I chased him, Mara following reluctantly. Inside, the air was cold, and the whispers were deafening. Shadows danced along the walls, twisting and stretching unnaturally. "Sam, stop!" I shouted, but he disappeared into the back room. When I found him, he was staring at a figure in the corner, a woman with her back to us. "Sam," I whispered, "we need to go." "She's here," he murmured, stepping closer. The figure turned. It wasn't his ex-wife. It wasn't even human. Its hollow eyes locked on mine, and the room erupted into chaos. We fled, dragging Sam with us. But the spirits weren't done. Outside, they took form, miners with hollow faces and broken limbs, crawling out of the ruins. Mara screamed, snapping pictures as if documenting them could make it less real. I grabbed her hand and ran, leaving Sam behind. "Jake!" he screamed, his voice raw with terror. "Don't leave me!" I hesitated, torn, but Mara pulled me toward the RV. "We can't help him," she cried. The RV started on the first try, as if the spirits wanted us to leave. We sped down the mountain, not stopping until we reached Silverton. Sam was never found. Search parties combed the area, but they found no trace of him. The official report listed him as a missing person, presumed dead. Mara and I don't talk about that night. We've tried to move on, but I still hear the whispers sometimes, in the dead of night. And when I close my eyes, I see Sam's face, twisted in fear, as the shadows claimed him. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. Animas Forks is one of them, and I'll never go back. My name is Hannah Lewis, and I'm 28 years old. This happened last October when I was chasing a story for my travel blog, Wild Horizons. I wish I could say it was one of those feel-good adventures where I rediscovered myself in nature or uncovered a heartwarming slice of local history. But the truth? The truth left me with scars I'll carry forever. It started when I rolled into Devil's Head Trail in Pike National Forest. It was mid-afternoon, and the autumn light was filtering through the pines, painting everything golden. I'd read about the trail in some old forum, a mix of breathtaking views and a ghost story about a witch who cursed the area. Perfect clickbait for a Halloween-themed blog post. The trip wasn't without hiccups. My RV sputtered as I parked in the lot, and the power flickered once before stabilizing. I chalked it up to the rough drive up the mountain and the vehicle's age. Still, the atmosphere prickled my skin. The air was thick, the kind of stillness that makes you feel like you're being watched. As I unloaded my gear, a ranger approached me. She was in her 50s, her dark hair streaked with silver, and her face weathered but kind. Her badge read, Ruth Vargas. "Trail's quiet today," she said, her tone cautious. "You hiking alone?" "Yep, research for a blog," I replied, flashing her my camera. Ruth frowned. "You writing about the witch?" I laughed. "Maybe, if I can find something spooky enough." Her face darkened. "People go missing up there sometimes. Good hikers, the woods. They don't always let you go where you want, and they don't always let you come back." I brushed her off with a nervous chuckle, but her words stuck with me. Just stay on the trail, she added, her voice softer now. And if you hear whispers, don't answer. The trail started easy enough. The towering pines swayed in the wind, and the crisp mountain air filled my lungs. I stopped every so often to snap pictures. Jagged rocks, a carpet of fallen leaves, and shafts of sunlight piercing the mist. But as I climbed higher, the woods grew darker. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches reaching like claws. Twice, I thought I heard something, a faint laugh, high-pitched and far away. But when I stopped to listen, all I heard was the wind. Then I saw him. A little boy, maybe 6 years old, standing by a tree just off the trail. He was dressed oddly, in clothes that looked like they belonged in a sepia-toned photo. Suspenders and a cap. "Hey, are you lost?" I called, stepping closer. He didn't answer, just stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. "It's okay," I said, crouching to his level. "Where are your parents?" He pointed deeper into the forest, into the shadows. Something about him unnerved me. His silence, the stillness of his face. But he was just a kid. I couldn't leave him. "All right," I said, hesitating. "Let's go find them." The boy led me off the trail, and the terrain grew wilder. Thick roots clawed at my boots, and the trees were so close I had to duck under branches. The air smelled damp and earthy, like rot. "Where are they?" I asked, but he didn't respond. Then I noticed something strange. His footprints were gone. I'd been following him for 15 minutes, but the ground behind him was undisturbed. "Wait," I said, stopping. "Who are you?" He turned to face me, his expression blank. Then he smiled, a wide, unnatural grin. His eyes turned black as coal, and his voice was a whisper layered with 100 others. "She's waiting for you." I stumbled back, my heart hammering. The boy, if he was ever a boy, vanished like smoke. I tried to retrace my steps, but the woods wouldn't let me. The trail I'd followed was gone, replaced by a maze of identical trees. My GPS was useless, stuck on a loading screen, and my phone had no signal. The whispers started again, louder this time. They came from all around me, overlapping and echoing, as if the forest itself was alive. "Come closer," they said. "We've been waiting." I ran, pushing through branches and underbrush until I stumbled into a clearing. In the center was an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and carved with strange symbols. The air was thick and heavy, like a storm was about to break. I felt her before I saw her. The figure emerged from the shadows, tall and thin, her face obscured by a tangle of black hair. Her limbs moved unnaturally, like a puppet on broken strings. When she spoke, her voice was a chorus of screams and whispers. "You came to me willingly," she said, though her mouth didn't move. I backed away, but the forest seemed to close in, the trees forming a wall around the clearing. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. "To show you the truth," she hissed. She raised a bony hand and the world shifted. I saw visions, settlers accusing her of witchcraft, dragging her to the altar, burning her alive. Her screams filled my ears, and the smell of smoke choked me. "You let them do this," she said, though I wasn't there. "And now you'll pay their debt." The witch advanced, her twisted form looming over me. I scrambled backward, my hand brushing against a jagged rock. Desperation took over. I grabbed the rock and hurled it at the altar. The stone shattered, and the symbols began to glow. The witch screamed, a sound that felt like it would split the earth. The whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the ground trembled beneath me. "Stop!" she shrieked, but I didn't. I smashed the altar again and again until it crumbled into dust. The forest exploded with light, and then silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back on the trail. The trees were still, The air was calm, and the whispers were gone. I stumbled back to my RV, my body aching and my mind spinning. On the windshield, etched into the glass, was a single symbol, the same one from the altar, burned into my memory. I drove away without looking back. I wrote the blog post a week later, but I left out the truth. No one would believe me anyway. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the whispers again, and I wonder if she's still waiting. My name is Ben Crawford, and I'm 43 years old. This happened last summer, during a trip to Lost Lake Campground near Gunnison National Forest, Colorado. I've been RVing solo for the past year, a decision I made after retiring early from firefighting. Too many bad calls, too many lives I couldn't save. I thought being out here alone in the quiet of nature might finally calm the ghosts in my head. I didn't expect to find something far worse. The drive to Lost Lake was peaceful enough, winding roads through dense pines with the sun filtering through in golden beams. The lake itself was stunning, a mirror of the sky surrounded by untouched wilderness. There were no other campers, and for once, the solitude felt like a gift. My plan was simple: set up the RV, take some photos, and spend a few days journaling by the water. I parked the RV at the edge of the campground, close enough to the lake to enjoy the view. The engine sputtered slightly as I killed it, but I figured it just needed a tune-up. After setting up, I spent the evening watching the sunset over the water, the sky a mix of fire and gold. For the first time in a while, my mind felt still. That night, I heard the first strange sound. It was faint at first, like a low rustling outside the RV. I chalked it up to the wind or maybe a raccoon, but as the hours dragged on, the sound grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps. Slow, steady, circling the RV. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the stillness of the trees and the faint ripple of the lake. I went back inside, locked the door, and told myself it was nothing. But deep down, I knew something felt wrong. The next morning, I found the first sign that I wasn't alone. There were claw marks on the side of the RV, long, jagged scratches that cut deep into the metal. They hadn't been there the night before. I tried to rationalize it. A bear, maybe? But the marks were too precise, too deliberate. I spent the day hiking around the lake, hoping to shake the unease. The forest was eerily silent, no birdsong or rustling leaves. The lake, too, was unnaturally still, its surface like glass. It wasn't until I found the journal that I realized I wasn't the first person to feel this way. It was lying in the dirt near the edge of the water, soaked but still legible. The pages were filled with frantic scrawls. They're watching me. The eyes. They're everywhere. Don't look at it. Don't let it see you. The last entry was a rough sketch of a tall, gaunt figure with glowing yellow eyes. My stomach tightened. I should have left right then and there, but I didn't. I told myself it was just a story, someone playing a prank. I went back to the RV and tried to forget about it. That night, I couldn't. The footsteps returned, louder this time. They circled the RV again and again, and I could hear breathing, slow, raspy, like air being dragged through a broken pipe. My flashlight flickered as I grabbed it, a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. I stepped outside and shone the light into the woods. That's when I saw them. 2 glowing yellow eyes staring at me from the tree line. They didn't blink, didn't move. Just stared. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The eyes vanished. A moment later, I heard laughter. High-pitched, almost childlike. It came from the lake. I ran back inside and locked the door, my hands trembling. The next day, I told myself I had to leave. I packed up my things. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the RV wouldn't start. The engine whined, sputtered, and died. I tried again. Nothing. Panic set in. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was miles away. I was stuck. I decided to hike the trail around the lake again, hoping to find some sense of direction. That's when I saw her. She was standing at the edge of the water, a girl no older than 17. Her long dark hair hung wet over her face, and her dress clung to her as if she'd just climbed out of the lake. "Hey!" I called, running toward her. "Are you okay?" She turned to me and my blood ran cold. Her eyes were empty, her face pale and gaunt. She raised a hand, pointing toward the woods. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then she was gone. I followed the direction she pointed, deeper into the forest. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the light. The air was heavy, damp, and smelled of rot. I found the campsite just as the sun began to set. It was old, overgrown with moss and vines. There was a rusted lantern, an empty tent, and a fire pit filled with ash. On a nearby tree, a missing persons flyer was pinned. It was her. Sarah Thompson, 17, missing for over a decade. The laughter returned, echoing through the trees, followed by the sound of snapping branches. I turned, and there it was. The lurker. It stood tall, its gaunt frame shrouded in shadows. Its eyes glowed like burning coals, piercing through the darkness. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. The lurker tilted its head, its eyes locking onto mine. The journal's warning flashed in my mind, "Don't look at it." I tore my gaze away and ran. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees twisting and shifting to block my path. The whispers grew louder, overlapping with Sarah's voice, begging me to save her. I stumbled into the clearing by the lake, gasping for air. The lurker was behind me, its raspy breathing filling the air. In the clearing, I saw the journal again, lying open on the altar-like stone. Sarah's voice echoed in my head, "Destroy it." I grabbed a rock and brought it down on the stone. The lurker screamed, a sound so guttural and raw it shook the ground. I hit it again and again until the stone cracked. The lurker lunged, but as the stone shattered, its form began to dissolve, black smoke rising into the air. The glowing eyes dimmed, and with one final scream, it vanished. The forest fell silent. Sarah appeared one last time, her face peaceful now. "Thank you," she whispered, before fading into the light. I stumbled back to the RV, my body trembling. The engine started on the first try. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from Lost Lake. I never wrote about what happened. Some stories are better left untold. But every so often, when I'm camping alone, I feel the weight of those yellow eyes on me, watching, waiting. My name is Sarah Hayes. I'm 36 years old, and this happened last October during a solo camping trip to San Isabel National Forest in Colorado. I went there for peace, to heal after my father's death. He loved the outdoors, and I thought being surrounded by nature might help me feel closer to him. What I found instead, I still can't explain. I pulled my RV into a secluded campsite near St. Elmo, an abandoned mining town. The air was crisp, the trees painted in fiery shades of autumn. The silence was almost surreal, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my tires. I stepped out and inhaled deeply, letting the forest stillness wash over me. The campsite was perfect, remote, with a stunning view of the mountains. After setting up, I decided to explore the ruins of St. Elmo. The town was eerie, its weathered wooden buildings sagging under decades of decay. Rusted mining equipment lay scattered like forgotten toys, and the air carried a faint metallic tang. That's where I met him. Old Man Garrett, a local historian. He was standing near the general store, leaning on a cane. "Not many people come here alone," he said, his voice gravelly but kind. "You must be braver than most." "Or just looking for some quiet," I replied with a smile. He nodded, but didn't return the smile. "You picked an interesting spot. The woods around here, they have stories. Sad ones." "What kind of stories?" Garrett's gaze drifted toward the tree line. "Back when St. Elmo was alive, there was a fever. Killed a lot of folks, mostly children. They buried them in unmarked graves. Some say their spirits never left." A chill ran down my spine, but I forced a laugh. "That's tragic, but I don't believe in ghosts." "Maybe you should," he said softly before shuffling away. That night, I built a small fire and settled into my camp chair with my journal. The flames cast flickering shadows on the surrounding trees, and the air grew colder as the night deepened. I jotted down thoughts about my dad, trying to remember his laughter, the way his face lit up when he talked about the mountains. That's when I heard it. Faint laughter, high-pitched and distant. I froze, my pen hovering above the page. The sound came again, this time closer. It was the unmistakable laughter of children. I stood, scanning the darkness with my flashlight, but the beam revealed nothing beyond the trees. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. No answer. Just the whisper of the wind through the pines. I convinced myself it was an echo, maybe a trick of the breeze, and forced myself to sit back down. But the laughter lingered in my mind long after it stopped. The next morning, I woke to find small, childlike handprints on the dusty windows of my RV. My stomach tightened as I stared at them. They were too small to be an adult's, and the prints were smeared, as if made by wet or dirty hands. "Probably just animals," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. I brushed them away and tried to focus on my plans for the day. As I hiked to a nearby stream to collect water, the forest felt different. The bird song I'd heard the day before was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. The trail was littered with broken branches, and I had the unsettling feeling that I was being watched. At the stream, I knelt to fill my container, but when I looked down, my reflection wasn't alone. 3 pale faces stared back at me from the water. Children, their eyes hollow and dark. I screamed and scrambled back, my heart pounding. When I dared to look again, the faces were gone, replaced by my own terrified expression. I returned to camp, determined to leave. But when I climbed into the RV and turned the key, the engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. "Come on," I whispered, hitting the steering wheel. The battery was fine. The gas tank was full. There was no reason for it not to start. As I stepped out to check the engine, I saw them. 3 figures standing at the edge of the clearing. They looked like children, but their clothes were ragged, their faces pale and smudged with dirt. One of them, a little girl with tangled hair, held a small doll. "Hello?" I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you lost?" The girl tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "We're not lost," she said. Her voice was soft but hollow, as though it came from far away. I took a cautious step closer. "Do you need help?" The children didn't move. The girl's dark eyes bored into mine. "Stay and play," she said, her tone almost pleading. I backed away, my pulse racing. I can't. I need to leave." The girl's face twisted into a scowl. The other children stepped forward, their movements jerky, unnatural. "You can't leave," one of them whispered. Panic surged through me as I scrambled back into the RV and locked the door. I could hear them outside, their small hands tapping on the windows. "Stay and play," they chanted, their voices rising into shrill giggles. Desperate, I grabbed the bundle of sage I'd brought, one of my dad's old superstitions, and lit it in the sink. The sharp herbal scent filled the RV, and the tapping stopped. When I looked out the window, the children were gone. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire with the sage burning beside me, my eyes darting to every shadow. The forest seemed alive, the trees swaying even though there was no wind. At one point, I thought I saw the girl standing at the edge of the firelight, her doll dangling limply in her hand. But when I blinked, she was gone. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I tried the RV one last time, and to my relief, the engine roared to life. As I drove down the bumpy road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The children were standing in the clearing, watching me go. The little girl raised her hand, as if waving goodbye. I thought it was over until I got home. A week later, I found the doll on my kitchen counter. It was old and filthy, with black button eyes and a stitched smile that seemed to mock me. I threw it away, but I swear sometimes I still hear the children's laughter in the dead of night. And I wonder if they're waiting for me to come back. My name is Hannah Reed. I'm 30 years old, and this happened in October of last year, in Black Canyon of the Gunnison National Park, Colorado. I still can't believe it. Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there in that canyon, hearing my name whispered from the shadows. It started as a reunion trip with friends. We'd grown apart over the years, but I thought getting away from the city and into the wild would remind us why we became friends in the first place. Jake, my boyfriend, loved the idea. Laura, my best friend since college, needed convincing. But I promised her it wouldn't be too extreme. Ethan, the wild card of our group, was all in. He'd do anything for a thrill. We set our sights on an isolated area near the canyon's rim. It wasn't an official campsite, but I'd found it mentioned on an old hiking forum. Untouched and off the beaten path, one post said. That was enough for me. I craved solitude. What I got was something else entirely. The first signs of trouble were small. Laura's sleeping bag was soaked on the first night after someone knocked over a water jug. We managed to dry it out by the fire, but she was already on edge. Then Jake realized he'd left the backup stove in the car, leaving us with only one burner for 4 people. Ethan laughed it off, saying it was all part of the adventure. Laura wasn't amused. But the real cracks started when we reached the trailhead. It wasn't marked on the official park map, just a narrow dirt path disappearing into the trees. "Are you sure this is safe?" Laura asked, hugging her jacket tighter. "It's fine," I said, feigning confidence. "I checked the GPS, it's just a short hike to the campsite." Jake rolled his eyes but kept quiet. Ethan, of course, was thrilled. "This is where the fun starts," he said, bounding ahead. "Let's see if the skinwalkers are home." "Not funny," Laura muttered, but Ethan was already too far ahead to hear her. The trail was steeper than I expected, winding through dense trees and sharp outcroppings. About halfway down, we found the first carving. It was etched into the trunk of a weathered pine. A crude figure with long, angular limbs and a head that looked more animal than human. "That's weird," Laura said, her voice shaking. "Probably just some bored teenagers," Jake said. "Come on, let's keep moving." But the carvings didn't stop. Every few hundred feet we'd find another, each more detailed than the last. One had glowing yellow eyes painted into the bark. The paint so fresh it stained my fingers when I touched it. By the time we reached the campsite, even Ethan was quiet. The clearing was small, nestled against a jagged cliff with a stunning view of the canyon below. We set up our tents and started a fire, but the tension lingered. Ethan tried to lighten the mood, cracking jokes about Laura's nerves and daring her to go explore the woods with him. "Not a chance," she snapped. "You can go get eaten by a skinwalker if you want. I'll stay right here." Jake and I laughed, but the humor felt forced. Even Ethan's grin faltered. That night, we heard the first voice. It was faint, drifting through the trees like smoke. "Hannah!" I bolted upright in my tent, my heart pounding. "Jake, did you hear that?" He groaned and turned over. "It's just the wind." But I wasn't so sure. The voice was too clear, too deliberate. I lay awake for hours listening, but it didn't come again. The next morning, we found Laura's flashlight and Ethan's water bottle missing. They turned up later, neatly stacked at the edge of the clearing. "Very funny," Laura said, glaring at Ethan. "It wasn't me," he protested. But no one believed him. By the second night, the tension was palpable. Ethan was restless, pacing the campsite and tossing rocks into the trees. Laura was jumpy, clutching her flashlight like a lifeline. Even Jake seemed uneasy, his usual skepticism giving way to quiet unease. That's when the mimicry started. We were sitting by the fire when we heard Jake's voice. "Hannah? Over here." Jake looked up, startled. "I didn't say that." The voice came again, more urgent. "Hannah, come here, hurry." I grabbed Jake's arm, my stomach churning. "Is someone out there?" Ethan shot to his feet, grinning. "Let's find out." "Don't," Laura started, but Ethan was already gone, disappearing into the trees. We waited, the fire crackling in the silence. Minutes passed, then an hour. Ethan didn't come back. When he finally returned, his face was pale, his bravado gone. "I saw something," he said, his voice trembling. "It wasn't human." Laura burst into tears. Jake tried to calm her, but his own hands were shaking. I forced Ethan to describe what he saw. "It looked like me," he said finally, "but wrong. Its arms were too long and its eyes—" He shuddered. "Its eyes were yellow." We didn't sleep that night. The voices continued, calling our names in a dozen different tones. Sometimes they sounded like Ethan, sometimes like Laura. Once, I swear, I heard my own voice echoing through the woods. The next morning, Jake was gone. His tent was empty, his boots still by the fire. We found his hat at the edge of the canyon, next to a set of bare footprints. They were too large to be human, with clawed toes that dug deep into the dirt. Ethan wanted to stay and search, but Laura and I refused. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Now." We packed in silence, the forest pressing in on us like a living thing. I felt its eyes on me, its breath on my neck. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made my heart race. As we climbed back up the trail, the voices followed. "Hannah, Ethan, Laura." They came from all around us, close enough to feel their breath on our ears. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was nearly dark. We thought we were safe, but the skinwalker wasn't done with us. It appeared at the edge of the trees, its limbs too long, its body twisted and wrong. It mimicked Jake's voice, pleading for help, then Laura's, then Ethan's. We backed away slowly, but Ethan snapped. "No more running," he growled, grabbing a rock. "You want me? Come get me." The skinwalker lunged. I didn't see what happened next. I was already running, dragging Laura behind me. Her screams echoed through the canyon, blending with Ethan's and the skinwalker's unearthly howl. When we finally reached the ranger station, we were hysterical. The rangers searched the area but found nothing. No Jake, no Ethan, no skinwalker. Just our abandoned campsite and those cursed carvings. Laura and I made it out alive, but we'll never be the same. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear their voices, Jake, Ethan, even my own, calling me back to the canyon. And I know, deep down, that something is still waiting for me there. My name is Mark Evans. I'm 41 years old, and this happened last October at Devil's Playground, a remote area near Pikes Peak in Colorado. If you've never been there, it's as stunning as it is desolate. Rolling ridges, strange rock formations, and a silence so deep it wraps around you. It was the kind of place I'd hoped would help clear my mind after my divorce. I never expected it to leave me questioning my sanity or my safety. I arrived in the early afternoon, the kind of crisp fall day when the air bites at your cheeks, but the sun is warm enough to make you peel off your jacket. My RV groaned up the winding road, bouncing over loose gravel until I reached the ridge. The rock formations were otherworldly, jagged spires and rounded boulders that looked like giant sentinels guarding the canyon. Locals called the largest one the Sentinel, and it wasn't hard to see why. It loomed above the landscape like a watchful figure, its rough surface etched with cracks and scars that looked deliberate, like ancient carvings. I parked near the Sentinel and stepped out, letting the solitude wash over me. This was why I came. No cell service, no people, just me and the wilderness. I pulled out my camera, eager to start photographing the ridge, but before I could snap the first shot, a truck pulled up behind me. The driver climbed out, a gruff-looking man in a worn sheriff's jacket. "You must be lost," he said, squinting at me. "No, I'm not," I replied. "Just here to camp and take some photos." He shook his head, his expression unreadable. "This ain't the best spot for that. A lot of strange things happen up here. Folks go missing sometimes." I laughed nervously. "What kind of strange things?" "Whispers in the wind, shadows that move when they shouldn't." He spat on the ground. "People get scared, and scared people make mistakes. I'd pack up if I were you." I thanked him for his concern, but brushed it off. I wasn't about to let a local legend ruin my trip. He left with a warning: "Don't stay past sunset," and I returned to setting up camp. As the sun dipped lower, painting the rocks in hues of orange and red, I felt a chill creep into the air. I grabbed my camera and set off to explore, eager to capture the fleeting light. Climbing to a nearby ridge, I snapped shots of mountain peaks framed by the bizarre rock formations. The place was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that amplifies every crunch of your boots on the gravel. It wasn't until I reached a narrow crevice between two boulders that I noticed the tracks. They were strange, hoof-like, but too large for any deer I'd ever seen. They meandered around the rocks, vanishing into the shadowed gulch below. I crouched to take a closer look, but the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. It felt like someone was watching me. The wind picked up as I returned to camp, whistling through the rocks with an almost melodic tone. By the time I lit a fire, darkness had swallowed the ridge and the stars burned fiercely overhead. The Sentinel loomed just beyond the circle of firelight, its hulking shape throwing jagged shadows across the campsite. I tried to shake the feeling that it was watching me. I was pouring myself a cup of coffee when I heard it. A faint, distant whisper. I froze, straining to hear over the crackle of the fire. "Mark," it called. So soft I thought I'd imagined it. I stood and scanned the darkness, the flashlight beam bouncing off the rocks. "Hello?" My voice sounded small against the vast emptiness. No answer. I told myself it was just the wind playing tricks and went back to the fire. But the whispers came again, closer this time. "Mark, help me!" The voice was female, and for a split second I thought it might be someone in trouble. But as I stepped toward the sound, flashlight in hand, the beam caught movement, just a flicker of shadow darting behind the sentinel. "Who's there?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No response, just the wind and the soft crackle of the fire. I backed away, every instinct screaming that something wasn't right. That's when Ellie appeared. She came out of nowhere, a young woman with wild hair and a battered backpack. "Sorry to scare you," she said, her breath coming in sharp gasps. "I got lost. Can I stay by your fire for a while?" I nodded, still rattled but relieved to see another person. She dropped her pack and crouched near the flames, rubbing her hands together for warmth. "This place gives me the creeps," she said. "You shouldn't be out here alone." "Funny, the sheriff said the same thing," I replied, trying to sound casual. "What's the deal with this place?" Ellie hesitated, her eyes darting toward the sentinel. "They call them the Watchers. Spirits, or something worse. They like to toy with people, make them see things, hear things. But you're fine if you don't acknowledge them." I laughed nervously. "Sounds like a campfire story." She didn't laugh. Ellie stayed for an hour before disappearing into the woods, refusing my offer to let her stay the night. After she left, the whispers started again. This time, they came from all directions, soft and insistent. "Mark, come here. Help." I covered my ears and stoked the fire, trying to drown them out. But the shadows around me seemed to grow taller, darker, twisting into grotesque shapes that writhed just beyond the firelight. I refused to look directly at them, remembering Ellie's warning. The night dragged on, each minute stretching into an eternity. At some point, the generator failed, plunging the RV into darkness. I stayed by the fire, clutching a makeshift torch, my camera forgotten in the chaos. When dawn finally broke, the whispers stopped and the shadows receded. I packed up quickly, eager to leave, but as I climbed into the RV, I noticed something chilling. Claw marks etched into the door. They were deep, deliberate, and unmistakably real. Driving down the mountain, I passed the sheriff's truck. He waved me down, his face grim. "Told you this wasn't a good spot," he said, glancing at the claw marks. "You're lucky you made it out." I didn't tell him about the whispers or the shadows. I didn't tell him about Ellie either. Part of me wasn't sure she was real. But as I reached the bottom of the ridge, I spotted something hanging from a tree, a battered backpack, identical to the one she'd carried. I never went back to Devil's Playground, and I never will. Sometimes, though, in the dead of night, I hear the whispers again. "Mark, come back." And I wonder if they're waiting for me. My name is Claire Hastings, and I'm 42 years old. This happened last September, when I decided to take my RV deep into the San Isabel National Forest. I was newly divorced, trying to rebuild my life 1 mile at a time, documenting my solo travels for a blog. I thought I'd finally found a purpose. Instead, I found something I can barely talk about. A curse, a choice, and a part of myself I didn't know existed. San Isabel had been on my radar for months, ever since I stumbled across a forum post about the Witch's Circle. The poster claimed it was an old stone formation deep in the woods, tied to the legend of a settler-turned-witch who cursed the area after her family was murdered. It sounded like the perfect mix of history and mystery to spice up my blog. Plus, I needed the distraction. The drive to the forest was uneventful. I parked my RV at a small, nearly abandoned campsite a few miles from the trailhead. It was the kind of place I usually loved, quiet, remote, and surrounded by towering pines. The air smelled like damp earth, and the breeze carried just a hint of autumn chill. But as I stepped out of the RV, a strange unease settled over me. The forest was too quiet, no birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of my own breathing. I shook it off. I had work to do. I grabbed my gear and followed the trail toward the rumored location of the Witch's Circle. The hike should have been straightforward, but my GPS glitched almost immediately, spinning me in circles no matter how many times I recalibrated. My watch stopped working too, the hands frozen at 3:17. Frustrated, I decided to navigate the old-fashioned way, using trail markers and my intuition. That's when I noticed the carvings. The trees along the path were etched with strange patterns. Symbols I didn't recognize. Spirals and jagged lines that seemed to radiate malice. They made the air feel colder, heavier. I tried not to look at them too closely. After 2 hours of hiking, I gave up. I hadn't found the circle and the sun was starting to dip below the treetops. Defeated, I turned back toward the campsite, promising myself I'd try again in the morning. That night, I sat by the campfire, typing up notes for my blog. The silence pressed in around me, broken only by the crackle of the flames. But as the fire died down, I heard something. A faint singing, high and lilting, like a lullaby carried on the wind. I froze, listening. It couldn't be another camper. I was the only one at this site, and the nearest occupied campsite was miles away. The singing grew louder, then softer, like it was circling me. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the trees, but the beam revealed nothing. The singing stopped as abruptly as it had started. I told myself it was just the wind. But as I climbed into the RV, locking every door and window, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I woke to find my RV covered in soot-like streaks, as if someone had dragged charred fingers along the exterior. The fire pit was cold and untouched, even though I clearly remembered dousing the flames the night before. My unease deepened, but I was too stubborn to leave. Determined to find the Witch's Circle, I packed my gear and set out again, ignoring the glitches on my GPS. I followed a faint deer trail through the woods, pushing past brambles and fallen branches until I stumbled into a clearing. There it was, the Witch's Circle. A ring of jagged stones, worn and weathered, encased in a faint mist that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. The air here was colder, and the silence was absolute. I approached cautiously, my boots crunching on frost-coated grass. As I stepped closer, I noticed scorch marks on the ground, forming a perfect spiral within the circle. The stones seemed to hum, a low vibration that I could feel in my chest. I raised my camera to take a picture, but the battery drained instantly. Frustrated, I pulled out my notebook to jot down details. That's when I saw it. A loose page tucked under one of the stones. It was my handwriting. The page was dated 2 days later, and it described events that hadn't happened yet. Finding the circle, hearing the singing, and a warning I hadn't written. Do not enter. Do not make a deal. I should have left then. I should have packed my things and driven as far from that forest as I could, but I didn't. Curiosity won, and I stepped into the circle. The air inside was heavier, almost suffocating. The humming grew louder, and the mist thickened, swirling around me like a living thing. Then she appeared. The witch. Her figure was faint at first, like a shadow, but as she stepped closer, she became solid. A woman in tattered 19th century clothing, her face veiled. Her voice was soft but sharp, like the edge of a blade. "You've come far," she said. "What will you offer?" "I don't understand," I stammered, backing away. The stones seemed to close in around me, trapping me in the circle. "You seek answers," she continued. "You seek purpose, but nothing is free." She raised a hand, and visions flooded my mind. Images of my failed marriage, my career spiraling, The nights I spent crying in the RV, wondering if I was even worth saving. The witch seemed to know everything about me, every failure, every regret. "You must give to receive," she said. "A piece of yourself, something precious." I was trembling, my mind racing. I had nothing to offer her, nothing except my notebook. The one place I'd poured my heart and soul, my plans for the future, the raw honesty I hadn't shared with anyone. It wasn't just a collection of notes, it was a lifeline. Without it, my journey felt meaningless. But I wanted to live. So, I pulled the notebook from my pack and placed it in the center of the circle. The witch watched silently as I lit a match and set the pages ablaze. The fire roared unnaturally high, and the witch's figure dissolved into the mist. The humming stopped, and the air lightened. When the flames died down, the notebook was gone, and the circle was just a ring of stones again, silent and still. I stumbled back to the RV, shaken but alive. The soot streaks were gone, and the engine had started on the first try. But as I drove out of the forest, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind. Not just the notebook, but a part of myself. Back home, I tried to rewrite my travel stories from memory, but the words wouldn't come. My dreams were haunted by the witch's face, half seen and veiled, her voice echoing, "What will you offer?" I haven't gone camping since, and I never will. My name is Ethan Marshall, and I'm 39 years old. This happened last autumn, when I took my RV to the Brainerd Lake Recreation Area in Colorado. I'd been feeling burned out, both as a photographer and as a person, and the trip was supposed to clear my head. Instead, it left me questioning everything: my career, my sanity, and even my own reflection. The drive up was uneventful, though the high-altitude air bit at my skin when I stepped out of the RV at the trailhead. Brainerd Lake lay below in perfect serenity, its surface like glass reflecting the jagged peaks above it. But my focus was Lake Isabel, farther up the trail, tucked away in the wilderness. I'd read about its stunning views and knew it could provide the perfect shot to anchor my upcoming gallery showcase. The RV was my lifeline, loaded with my gear, enough supplies for 3 days, and just enough gas to get back down. I parked it in a pull-off by the trailhead and took my camera to scout. The crisp, pine-scented air was intoxicating, and for the first time in months I felt a twinge of hope. That hope didn't last long. On my way back to the RV after an hour of hiking, I noticed something odd. The trees along the path had markings on them, symbols carved deep into the bark, like runes or ancient writing. I brushed my fingers over one, a jagged spiral enclosed by slashes, and felt an unnatural chill. I looked around, expecting to see other hikers, but I was alone. When I got back to the RV, I found the first anomaly. One of my camera lenses had shattered. It hadn't been dropped or mishandled. It was still in its protective case. I told myself it was a freak accident. I had spares. I didn't let it bother me, not yet. That night, after dinner, I sat outside the RV under a sky splattered with stars. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional whisper of wind. But then I heard it. A soft knock, faint but distinct, coming from the side of the RV. I froze, flashlight in hand, scanning the darkness. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded too loud even to me. No response. I checked the perimeter with the light and found nothing. No prints, no signs of wildlife. I told myself it was just the wind. I locked the door before climbing into bed. The next day, I hiked to Lake Isabel. The trail was more challenging than I'd expected, steep and rocky, but the view was worth it. The lake spread out like a mirror, framed by towering peaks. I set up my tripod and started shooting, snapping pictures of the reflections and the shifting colors of the sky. That's when I heard it. "Ethan," a voice whispered. I froze, my hand on the shutter button. I turned slowly, scanning the trail behind me. No one was there. "Ethan," the voice repeated. Softer this time, almost musical. It sounded familiar, like a memory I couldn't quite place. My skin prickled. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer, just the ripple of water and the faint whistle of the wind. But when I looked back at the camera, the lens was fogged over. I wiped it clean and kept shooting, but the unease lingered. At dusk, the lake turned a brilliant shade of orange, and I was determined to capture it. My fingers worked the camera instinctively, framing shot after shot. That's when I saw it. A figure standing waist-deep in the water, far out near the center. It was pale and unmoving, and its face was turned toward me, though I couldn't make out any features. I squinted, thinking it might be a trick of the light, but when I adjusted my focus, the figure tilted its head toward me. I staggered back, my foot slipping on a loose rock. When I looked up again, the figure was gone. I packed up my gear in a panic, practically running back to the RV. The trail seemed longer this time, and I kept hearing faint footsteps behind me, though when I turned around there was nothing but empty forest. Back at the RV, I locked the doors and drew the curtains. I tried to distract myself by reviewing the photos I'd taken that day, but something was wrong. Every image was distorted, like a faint shadow hovered in the background of each shot. One picture taken at the lake sent a shiver down my spine. A blurry shape that hadn't been there before was standing at the water's edge. Its head cocked at the same angle as the figure I'd seen. I closed the laptop and poured myself a stiff drink, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The knocking started again, louder this time. 3 deliberate raps, followed by silence. Then another 3, like a ritual. I didn't dare open the door. My RV's power cut out just after midnight. The heater died with it, and the cold crept in fast. I grabbed my flashlight and crawled under the table, clutching my camera like it was some kind of weapon. The whispers came back, circling the RV, calling my name in voices I recognized. My mother, my sister, even my own. "Ethan," my own voice whispered from outside. "Come see, you'll love it." I covered my ears, but the whispers grew louder, building to a crescendo until I screamed for them to stop. And then they did. By morning, the whispers were gone, but my nerves were shot. I was sleep-deprived, freezing, and ready to leave. But when I turned the ignition, the RV wouldn't start. The battery, fully charged the day before, was dead. "Damn it," I muttered, hitting the steering wheel. I wasn't sure I could hike out without collapsing. I'd have to try. But before I could grab my pack, I caught movement in the corner of my eye. The figure from the lake was standing outside the RV just beyond the frosted window. Its face was clearer now, pale, waterlogged, and distorted, like a bloated corpse. But the eyes were mine. They stared at me with a blank intensity, as if waiting for something. I backed away, knocking over the table. "What do you want?" I shouted. The figure didn't move, but its mouth opened slowly. A sound like rushing water filled the RV, deafening me, drowning out my thoughts. I stumbled, falling to the floor, clutching my head. I don't know how I managed to get up and open the door, but I did. The figure was gone, though footprints, bare, human footprints, led from the lake to the RV. My instincts screamed at me to run, and I obeyed, grabbing only my camera before bolting down the trail. The hike back was a blur. The whispers followed me, louder and more insistent, but I didn't stop. When I finally reached the main road, a passing car slowed and honked. The driver, a man in his 60s, rolled down his window. "You okay, son?" I nodded shakily. though I knew I looked anything but. My RV, back there. Not safe to camp up here alone, he said. Too many stories. I didn't ask what he meant. I didn't want to know. I made it back to Denver that evening, though I left the RV behind. I've tried to forget what happened, but it clings to me like a shadow. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear the whispers again. And when I reviewed the last photo on my camera, I saw it, the figure standing behind me, grinning with my face. I don't go near lakes anymore. My name is Ethan Wells. I'm 21 years old, a college student obsessed with folklore and the paranormal. What happened in the Lost Creek Wilderness, Colorado, isn't something I like to talk about, but I feel like writing it down might help me make sense of it, or maybe convince myself it was all real. This started in late September, just before the weather turned bitter cold. I convinced my sister Lila, her boyfriend Ryan, and her best friend Sierra to join me on a weekend camping trip. I had heard stories about shadowy figures that haunted the rocky labyrinths of Lost Creek. It was supposed to be an adventure, a chance to see if there was any truth to the tales, or at least to explore one of the most beautiful, isolated places in Colorado. Lila, who's 25, and has always been the fearless leader of any group, was all for it. Ryan, 27, was excited too, mostly for the physical challenge. He didn't take my fascination with ghost stories seriously and joked about Bigfoot hunting the whole way there. Sierra, on the other hand, was hesitant. She's 23 and has always been sensitive to the vibe of a place. She told me she had a bad feeling about the trip but didn't want to ruin the fun. We parked the RV at a trailhead early Saturday morning, stuffed our gear into backpacks, and headed into the wilderness. The plan was to hike in about 6 miles, set up camp, and spend the night exploring the area around one of the caves rumored to be haunted. The forest was beautiful. Towering pines, crisp mountain air, and the golden glow of aspen leaves catching the sun. But as we hiked deeper, something felt off. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots and the occasional scrape of Ryan's trekking poles. Lila said it was probably because the area wasn't heavily trafficked, but I wasn't so sure. Around mid-afternoon, we reached a clearing surrounded by jagged rock formations. The place looked like it hadn't been touched by humans in years. We pitched our tent, or tried to. That's when Ryan discovered the tent poles were missing. He swore up and down that he had packed them, but they were nowhere to be found. We ended up improvising a makeshift shelter using tarps and ropes. It wasn't great, but it would have to do. After dinner, we sat around the fire, the light flickering off the rocks and trees. That's when Sierra mentioned she felt like we were being watched. I laughed it off, trying to lighten the mood, but her unease was contagious. The quiet now felt oppressive, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. That night, strange things started happening. First, my flashlight disappeared. I searched everywhere, but it was gone. When I gave up and sat back by the fire, I noticed it lying neatly on the ground a few feet away, as if someone had placed it there. I didn't say anything to the others, not wanting to freak them out. As we turned in for the night, I thought I heard whispers coming from the trees. Faint, indistinct, but undeniably there. Lila told me it was just the wind, but I wasn't so sure. The next morning, we decided to check out one of the caves about a mile from our camp. The entrance was dark and foreboding, with claw-like marks etched into the rock. Ryan laughed, saying it was probably from some animal. But the marks were deep and deliberate, like something or someone had been trying to get in or out. Inside the cave, the air was damp and stale. We found scattered bones, small, probably from animals, but it still made Sierra gag. I noticed something else, strange symbols carved into the stone. They were crude but unmistakable, resembling the kinds of sigils I had seen in Navajo skinwalker legends. A chill ran down my spine. "Creepy, huh?" Ryan said, grinning as he stepped deeper into the cave. "This where the ghost comes out and gets us?" "Don't joke," Sierra snapped. "This place isn't right." We didn't stay long. That night, things escalated. As we sat by the fire, we heard what sounded like someone calling my name from the woods. The voice was faint, distant, but unmistakable. I froze. "Did you hear that?" I asked. Lila nodded, her face pale. Ryan shrugged it off, saying it was probably just an echo or a coyote. But then it happened again, louder this time. The voice was identical to mine, and it sent a wave of fear coursing through me. Ryan, ever the skeptic, grabbed his flashlight and marched toward the trees. "I'll prove it's nothing," he said. "Ryan, no!" Sierra yelled. But he ignored her. He disappeared into the darkness, the beam of his flashlight bobbing between the trees. Minutes passed, then an hour. Lila and I started shouting his name, but there was no response. Sierra was shaking, on the verge of tears. Finally, Ryan returned, but something was wrong. He was silent, his face blank, his movements stiff. He sat by the fire without saying a word, staring into the flames. When I asked where he had been, he didn't respond. That's when I remembered the skinwalker lore. According to Navajo legend, these malevolent shapeshifters could mimic voices and even take on the appearance of their victims. The claw marks on the cave, the strange symbols, the eerie silence, they all pointed to one thing. "This isn't Ryan," I whispered to Lila. She looked at me like I was crazy, but then she glanced at Ryan's shadow. It didn't match his movements. While he sat still, the shadow swayed and twitched unnaturally. Lila gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "What do we do?" she whispered. Before I could answer, Ryan, or whatever was pretending to be Ryan, stood up and walked toward us. Its movements were jerky, almost inhuman. Sierra screamed and backed away, tripping over a rock. I remembered something I had read about skinwalkers. They avoided pure salt. Frantically, I grabbed the spilled salt from our food bag and drew a circle around us. The creature stopped, tilting its head as if confused. Then it let out a blood-curdling screech and lunged, only to be stopped by the invisible barrier. It circled us, snarling and clawing at the ground, but it couldn't get in. We huddled together, terrified, as it prowled around the salt ring, its glowing eyes fixed on us. We stayed like that until dawn, too scared to move. As the first light crept over the horizon, the creature let out one final screech and vanished into the trees. We didn't wait to see if it would return. We grabbed what little gear we could carry and ran. When we reached the RV, we realized Ryan was gone. The real Ryan. We searched for him, screaming his name, but there was no trace. We made it back to town and reported what had happened, but no one believed us. They said Ryan had probably wandered off and gotten lost. But I knew the truth. The thing in the woods wasn't human, and it had taken him. Years later, I returned to Lost Creek to write about what happened. Near the cave, I found something etched into the rock. "Help me, Ryan." I don't know if I'll ever go back again. Some things are better left lost. My name is Claire Bennett, and I'm 38 years old. I make my living as a freelance writer, focusing on outdoor adventures and travel. Most people think it's a dream job, hiking through scenic forests, camping under the stars, and putting those experiences into words. It is, for the most part. But what happened in Devil's Hollow last September still keeps me up at night. I should have listened to the warnings, but like always, curiosity got the better of me. I drove my old RV up a narrow dirt road winding through the San Juan National Forest. My destination was Devil's Hollow, a place I'd read about in forums filled with whispered warnings of strange disappearances and occult activity from decades past. To me, it was a challenge. A way to prove that there's no such thing as haunted places, just overactive imaginations and bad luck. The day was crisp, the trees golden with the first touch of autumn. I pulled into the trailhead, parked, and stepped out to take in the quiet wilderness. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. There was no sound of birds or the rustle of leaves, just the distant hum of the wind. As I double-checked my gear, a man in a forest ranger uniform approached. His name tag read Jake, and he looked like he'd been living in the woods for years. "You heading into the hollow?" he asked, his tone more accusatory than curious. "Just for a couple of nights," I replied, trying to sound casual. Jake frowned, glancing at my RV. "You don't want to camp there. It's not safe." I laughed nervously. "Wild animals." Jake hesitated. "Not exactly. People don't come back from there sometimes. Strange things happen, just don't stay too close to the hollow. And if you hear something calling you, don't follow it." I should have taken him seriously, but instead, I thanked him and went about my business. Writers thrive on atmosphere, and his warning felt like a gift, something to spice up my article. I hiked in about 3 miles, stopping just outside the hollow. The trail narrowed, winding between jagged rock formations and dense trees. The further I went, the more the air seemed to change, heavy with something I couldn't quite name. I found a small clearing and set up my camp. By then, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I gathered some firewood and settled in with my notebook, jotting down observations for my article. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often I thought I heard whispers carried on the wind, but I convinced myself it was just the sound of the trees creaking. The next day, I decided to venture deeper into the hollow. The terrain grew rougher, the trees thicker, their twisted branches forming shapes that looked almost human. That's when I saw the footprints. They weren't normal footprints. They were bare, elongated with toes that seemed unnaturally long. They led away from the trail and disappeared into the underbrush. I took a photo with my phone, but something about the sight made my stomach churn. "Probably an animal," I muttered to myself, though I didn't believe it. By afternoon, a storm rolled in. Rain pelted the trees and a small landslide blocked the trail back to camp. I had to find an alternate route, getting turned around more than once. By the time I reached my campsite, it was almost dark. That's when I noticed the symbols. They were drawn in the dirt around my RV, strange, looping patterns that didn't make any sense. My first thought was kids playing a prank, but there was no one else out here. As I examined them, the wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, almost melodic voice. "Claire, Claire." It was my name. I spun around, scanning the trees. There was no one there. Shaken, I decided to hike to the trailhead to check my GPS. On the way, I ran into a woman coming from the opposite direction. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with pale skin and dark eyes that seemed to bore right through me. "You're Claire," she said, her voice soft but certain. I froze. "Do I know you?" "No," she replied, her lips curling into a small, unsettling smile. "But the hollow knows you. You should leave before it gets dark again." Before I could ask her what she meant, she walked past me and disappeared down the trail. That night, the whispers came back, louder this time. They weren't just random sounds, they were voices, overlapping, speaking my name in tones that were both familiar and alien. I stayed inside the RV, locking the doors and shutting the curtains. but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. At some point, I fell into a restless sleep, only to wake up to the sound of scratching on the windows. I froze, my heart hammering. "Claire!" The voice was right outside, low and guttural. I didn't dare move. When the scratching stopped, I peeked out the window and saw a figure standing just beyond the firelight. It was tall, its shape indistinct, shifting as if it were made of smoke. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside, but the figure was gone. By morning, I'd had enough. I packed up my gear and prepared to leave, but my RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, no matter how many times I turned the key. Panic set in. The symbols around the RV seemed fresher, as if someone, or something, had redrawn them during the night. Desperate, I remembered something I'd read about offerings in old folklore. If this thing was tied to the land, maybe I could appease it. I rummaged through my bag, pulling out the only thing that felt meaningful: my mother's ring. A small silver band I always carried but rarely wore. I walked to the edge of the clearing, where the symbols were the most concentrated, and placed the ring on the ground. "I don't know what you want," I said aloud, my voice trembling, "but take this and leave me alone." The forest went silent. Then, from somewhere deep within the trees, I heard a low, rumbling growl. The ground beneath my feet seemed to vibrate, and for a moment I thought the air itself was pressing in on me. But then it stopped. I ran back to the RV and tried the engine one last time. It roared to life. I didn't question it, I just drove, tearing down the narrow dirt road as fast as I could. As I reached the edge of the forest, I glanced in the rearview mirror. That's when I saw her, Lila, standing by the side of the road, her dark eyes glowing faintly. She smiled at me, the same unsettling smile as before. I haven't been back to Devil's Hollow since. I finished my article, but I left out the details of what happened. Some places are better left unexplored, and some warnings are better heeded. I still think about Lila, though. About how she knew my name, about the strange look in her eyes, about the voice that called to me in the night, and about how, no matter where I go, I can't seem to shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. My name is Daniel Harris, and I'm 45 years old. I'm a geology professor, but more than that, I'm a man searching for quiet. Ever since my wife, Anna, passed 2 years ago, I've retreated into my work and the solace of the outdoors. That's what brought me to Marble Canyon in Colorado. I had heard about its unique rock formations and the supposed untapped mineral deposits, but it wasn't just research that drew me here. The isolation called to me. This happened in late October, just as the first hints of winter began to creep into the air. The drive out was beautiful, the kind of scenery that fills travel magazines. Jagged cliffs, golden aspens, and skies so clear they seemed endless. But what unfolded in the days that followed? That wasn't beauty, that was something else entirely. I arrived at the Marble Canyon trailhead in the early afternoon, parking my RV in a small clearing at the base of the ridges. The sun was bright, but the shadows cast by the canyon walls seemed unnaturally long. I unloaded my equipment and planned my first hike for the next morning. Before I could head out, an older woman at a small roadside museum caught my attention. Her name was Ruby, a local historian who maintained a small collection of artifacts from the area's mining days. "You camping out there?" she asked, her weathered hands resting on the counter. "Just for a few nights," I replied, explaining my research on mineral formations. She shook her head, her expression darkening. "People shouldn't stay there too long. There's a reason they call it Devil's Hollow. The miners, they called it cursed." I smiled politely. "I'll be careful." But Ruby leaned in closer. Careful won't matter if the Revenant finds you. It doesn't forgive, and it doesn't forget. I brushed off her words as local superstition, thanked her, and left. It wasn't until later that night, as I sat in my RV under a blanket of stars, that I started to wonder if she knew something I didn't. The first day of hiking was uneventful, though the terrain was rougher than I expected. The rock formations were spectacular, jagged pillars rising like sentinels from the canyon floor. I found traces of old mining operations, rusted tools, collapsed shafts, and abandoned shacks. It was clear no one had been out here in years. But as the sun began to set, the air grew colder. By the time I returned to my RV, frost had started to form on the windows, even though the forecast had predicted mild temperatures. I turned on the heater, made a quick dinner, and settled in for the night. That's when I heard it. A faint metallic clinking, like the echo of a pickaxe striking rock. I paused, thinking it might be some animal rustling in the canyon, but then I heard it again. Rhythmic, deliberate. I stepped outside with my flashlight, scanning the area. Nothing. Just the empty expanse of the canyon and the faint whisper of the wind. The second night was worse. I spent the day exploring deeper into the canyon, collecting samples and taking notes. I found a small journal in an abandoned shack, the pages brittle and stained with time. The entries described the daily lives of the miners, but the final pages were disturbing. They spoke of a betrayal, of men turning on each other in desperation, and of something in the darkness that would not let them leave. I returned to my RV uneasy but still determined to stay. That night, the metallic clinking returned, louder this time, and then came the voices. At first, I thought it was the wind carrying strange echoes through the canyon, but the voices were distinct, low murmurs, calling my name. I froze, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from the direction of the shack I had visited earlier. "Who's there?" I called out, stepping outside with a flashlight. The air was biting cold, and the beam of light barely pierced the thick shadows. The voices stopped, but as I turned to go back inside, I saw it. A shadowy figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was tall, its form indistinct, like smoke given shape. And then, just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. By the third night, I was ready to leave, but a landslide had blocked the narrow road leading out of the canyon. I was trapped. The heater in the RV stopped working, and the temperature inside plummeted. I bundled up in layers, but the cold seemed to seep into my bones. The clinking returned, louder and more insistent, accompanied by the whispers. But this time, the whispers weren't just calling my name, they were using Anna's voice. "Daniel," the voice said, soft and pleading. "Help me." I stepped outside, my breath visible in the frigid air. The clearing was bathed in pale moonlight, and there, at the edge of the canyon, was the figure again. Only now, it was clearer. It had the vague shape of a man, but with hollow eyes that glowed faintly, like embers. It held a spectral pickaxe, which it dragged along the ground, the sound reverberating through the canyon. "Anna?" I whispered, taking a hesitant step forward. The figure moved toward me, and as it did, the temperature dropped further. I could see frost forming on the rocks and on the edge of my flashlight. My instincts screamed to run, but my legs refused to move. I retreated into the RV, slamming the door behind me. But the Revenant wasn't done. The windows began to frost over completely, the glass cracking under the pressure of the cold. The whispers intensified, blending into a cacophony of voices, accusatory, desperate, angry. Desperate for answers, I opened the journal again. One entry stood out. The miners believed that salt could protect them from the vengeful spirit, though they hadn't been able to test it before succumbing to the Revenant's wrath. I grabbed the salt from my camping supplies and stepped outside. The figure was closer now, its form more defined, its face a twisted mask of rage. I poured a line of salt around the RV, the whispers faltering as I did. The Revenant stopped just short of the barrier, letting out a bone-chilling screech that echoed through the canyon. It raised its pickaxe, striking the invisible barrier with a force that sent me stumbling back. But the salt held. As the sun began to rise, the Revenant faded, retreating into the shadows of the canyon. The whispers ceased, and the temperature began to rise. I wasted no time packing up what I could carry and hiking out on foot, leaving the RV behind. I didn't stop until I reached a ranger station miles away. When I told the rangers what had happened, they looked at me with a mix of disbelief and pity. One of them muttered something about Devil's Hollow claiming another one. I never retrieved the RV. I couldn't bring myself to return to Marble Canyon, not after what I saw. But the journal stayed with me, a reminder of what had happened. Sometimes, late at night, I open it and read the final scrawled entry. It won't let us leave, not alive. And sometimes, just sometimes, I still hear the faint sound of a pickaxe in the distance. My name is Greg Marsh, and I'm 35 years old. This happened in the summer of 2022 during a solo camping trip in Pike National Forest, Colorado. I'd been living off the grid for a while, traveling in my RV, testing my survival skills, and enjoying the quiet isolation the wilderness offered. At least, that's what I thought I was doing. What I found in that forest changed everything. The drive to Pike National Forest was uneventful. Miles of winding mountain roads bordered by towering pines. I'd heard about the place from a fellow traveler who mentioned abandoned mining villages deep in the woods. It sounded perfect to me. A mix of history, wilderness, and exploration. No tourists, no noise, just me and nature. When I arrived, I found a secluded spot to park the RV and set up camp. The air smelled of pine needles and damp earth, and the silence was almost oppressive, broken only by the occasional bird call. Perfect. The first sign of trouble was small, barely noticeable. My RV's battery, which had been fully charged, suddenly died. No lights, no power, no radio. I cursed under my breath, grabbed my gear, and decided to hike instead. I figured I'd sort it out when I got back. I spent the first day exploring trails near my campsite. The forest was dense and the paths were overgrown, but I loved the challenge. About halfway through the hike, I met a woman named Katie. She was in her early 30s, with short blonde hair and an easy smile. She seemed out of place, too cheerful and clean for someone wandering these remote trails. "You here alone?" she asked as we walked together for a bit. "Yeah," I replied. "Just testing my limits, you?" "Something like that," she said, glancing at the trees. "You should be careful out here. This forest, it has a way of messing with people." I laughed it off. "I've been doing this for years. I can handle it." Katie didn't laugh. She just nodded, gave me a strange look, and then disappeared down a side trail. I called after her, but she didn't respond. That night, I woke up to a sharp pain in my arm. It felt like a burn, hot and stinging. When I turned on my flashlight, I saw it. A mark on my forearm. It looked like a brand, a jagged symbol burned into my skin. My first thought was a spider bite or poison ivy, but the edges of the mark glowed faintly, like embers. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the pain stayed with me. By morning, the mark hadn't faded. If anything, it was brighter, almost pulsating. I decided to hike again, hoping the distraction would clear my head. That's when I met Old Man Klein. He was sitting on the porch of a ramshackle cabin, smoking a pipe. His beard was long and gray, his eyes sharp. He didn't seem surprised to see me. "You got the brand," he said, gesturing to my arm. I froze. "What are you talking about?" "The witch's brand," he said. "She marked you." I laughed nervously. "You've got to be kidding. You think I'm joking?" His eyes narrowed. "This forest belongs to her. You go where you're not supposed to, and she marks you. It's a curse, boy. You can't leave until she lets you." I left the old man's cabin feeling uneasy but still skeptical. A curse? A witch? It was ridiculous. But as the day went on, things got stranger. I started hearing things, soft whispers that seemed to come from the trees. I'd spin around, but no one was there. At one point, I thought I saw Katie again, standing in a clearing. I called out to her, but when I approached, she was gone. In her place, I found a small pile of stones, carefully arranged, with the same symbol that was on my arm carved into one of them. The real terror began that night. The air in the RV was stifling, thick and oppressive. I tried to sleep, but the whispers were louder now, insistent, almost angry. Around midnight, the RV began to shake violently, as if something outside was trying to tip it over. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, my heart pounding. The forest was unnaturally quiet. No wind, no animals, just silence. Then I saw her. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, tall and thin, her limbs too long, her fingers clawed. Her face was obscured by shadows, but her eyes glowed faintly, like twin embers in the dark. She raised a hand and pointed at me, and the mark on my arm flared with searing pain. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut. The whispers turned into laughter, cruel and mocking. I didn't sleep that night. By morning, I knew I had to leave. I packed my gear and started the RV, but the engine sputtered and died. I tried again, but it was no use. The battery was completely drained. I decided to hike back to the road and get help, but no matter which trail I took, I always ended up back at the campsite. The forest was like a maze, twisting and looping, defying logic. By the third day, I was desperate. The mark on my arm had spread, black veins snaking up toward my shoulder. I felt weaker, my energy sapped, as if the forest itself was draining me. That night, I decided to confront her. I waited until the whispers started, until the laughter echoed through the trees. Then I stepped outside and called into the darkness. "What do you want?" The laughter stopped. The forest was silent for a moment, then she appeared again, stepping into the clearing with her unnatural, jerky movements. She was closer this time, her glowing eyes boring into me. "You trespassed," she said, her voice a low, guttural rasp. "You took what is mine." "I didn't take anything," I said, my voice trembling. "You took time," she hissed. "Now it is mine." She raised a hand and I collapsed, the mark on my arm burning like fire. My vision blurred and I heard her voice in my head, whispering promises of pain, of eternal servitude. I don't know how I escaped. The next thing I remember is stumbling into the RV, gasping for air. The engine roared to life, and I drove blindly, tearing down the dirt road until I reached the highway. The mark is still there, a constant reminder of what happened. The veins have stopped spreading, but I can still feel them sometimes, pulsing under my skin. And at night, when it's quiet, I hear whispers. I don't know what she took from me, but I know she's not done. Not yet. My name is Maya Harper, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in the fall of 2021, during a photography trip to Red Feather Lakes, Colorado. At the time, I was chasing stories of eerie landscapes, abandoned places, and legends no one else dared to explore. I thought I could capture something unique, What I found was something I can't unsee, something that still haunts my dreams. It was late October when I convinced my boyfriend, Evan, and my best friend, Jody, to come along. Evan was 29, practical, and skeptical of anything supernatural. He mostly came to keep me safe. Jody, 27, was the opposite. Nervous, a believer in ghost stories, and reluctant to join, but desperate to prove herself braver than she felt. We drove to Red Feather Lakes in my RV, packed with camping gear, cameras, and a thick folder of research I'd collected on the area. The Creepy Pines Trail, they called it. A place where ghostly lanterns were said to guide travelers off the path, into the woods, where they'd vanish forever. It sounded perfect. The legend was old, dating back to the late 1800s when settlers built cabins here, only to abandon them after reports of strange occurrences. The first day was uneventful. The lakes reflected the fiery colors of the autumn trees, and the crisp mountain air filled me with excitement. But trouble began almost immediately when we set up camp. The tent poles snapped as Evan was putting them together. He cursed under his breath while I tried to fix it with duct tape, but it sagged like a deflated balloon. Then my camera, the one I'd invested thousands of dollars in, refused to power on. I fiddled with it, swapping batteries and memory cards, but it was useless. I'd have to rely on my old backup camera, a finicky piece of equipment prone to glitches. "That's a sign, Maya," Jody said nervously, watching me wrestle with the gear. "We shouldn't be here." Evan rolled his eyes. "It's a broken camera, Jody, not a ghost." "Things break," I added, trying to lighten the mood. "But this place? It's perfect. Look at the light on those trees." Jody didn't respond, but I caught her glancing nervously at the tree line, as if expecting something to emerge. That night, the whispers began. We'd been exploring the ruins of an old cabin, its timbers rotted and marked with strange symbols scratched into the wood. I was too focused on capturing the eerie atmosphere to notice the shift at first, but Jody froze mid-step. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" Evan asked, shining his flashlight around the room. "Someone's whispering." I strained to listen, but all I heard was the wind rattling through the broken windows. "It's just the wind," I said, snapping a photo of a particularly deep scratch on the wall. But later, as we walked back to camp, I heard it too. Soft, indistinct voices carried on the breeze. I stopped in my tracks, my flashlight darting towards the trees. "Did you hear that?" Evan sighed. "Seriously? Now you're buying into this?" "I heard it," I insisted. As we settled into our sleeping bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps outside the tent. "Evan," I hissed, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned, half asleep. "Probably a deer." But when I peeked outside with my flashlight, there was nothing there. Just the trees, swaying gently in the wind. I convinced myself it was nothing and went back to sleep. The next day, we hiked deeper into the woods. That's when we saw it. A faint, flickering light in the distance. It moved slowly, swinging side to side like someone carrying a lantern. "Look," I pointed, grabbing my camera. Evan squinted. "Probably a camper." "There's no one else out here," Jody whispered, clutching her jacket. "Maya, don't follow it." But I was already stepping off the trail, my heart racing with excitement. "It's just a light," I said, snapping a picture. "This is what we came for." The lantern led us to a clearing where the air felt wrong, heavy, like the weight of a storm about to break. The trees seemed taller, their branches curling inward, forming a canopy that blocked out the sky. And there, in the center of the clearing, stood an old, crumbling cabin I hadn't seen on any maps. Jody grabbed my arm. "We shouldn't be here." But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and it creaked on rusted hinges. Inside, the air was damp and cold, smelling of decay. The walls were covered in the same symbols we'd seen before, but deeper, angrier, as if someone had carved them with fury. And on the floor, scattered in the dirt, were bones. Animal bones, I told myself. But the thought didn't comfort me. That night, the lantern returned. It hovered at the edge of the campsite, swinging slowly. This time, it wasn't just light. I saw a figure, a shadowy, skeletal silhouette holding the lantern. It didn't move, just stood there, watching. "Get in the RV," Evan whispered, his voice tight with fear. I grabbed my camera, snapping picture after picture, but the shadow didn't appear in the viewfinder. Only the light. Jody was shaking, tears streaming down her face. "We need to leave, Maya, now." But as we climbed into the RV, Evan froze. His eyes glazed over, and he muttered something I couldn't understand, a language I didn't recognize. "Evan?" I shook him, but he didn't respond. His face twisted, contorting into an expression I didn't recognize, like he wasn't him anymore. Then the lantern moved. It swung closer, faster, the figure now walking toward us with jerky, unnatural movements. I slammed the RV door shut, locking it. The next hour was a blur. Evan collapsed, clutching his head, as Jody and I tried to wake him. The lantern's glow circled the RV, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The scratching began shortly after, long, deliberate strokes like claws dragging across metal. "We're going to die," Jody sobbed. "No, we're not." I grabbed my camera. "Stay with Evan, I'll distract it." "You're insane," she cried. But I didn't listen. I stepped outside, flashlight and camera in hand. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, its lantern casting an unnatural, greenish glow. I snapped the flash, and for a moment it recoiled, the light seeming to wound it. But then it screamed. A high, unearthly wail that froze me in place. It charged, its skeletal hands reaching for me. I don't remember much after that. Somehow, I made it back to the RV. We drove through the night, the lantern chasing us, its glow appearing in the rearview mirror no matter how far we went. When we finally reached the highway, it was gone. Evan recovered, but didn't remember anything. Jody never spoke about what she saw in the lantern's glow, but I could tell it broke something in her. Back home, I developed the photos. Most were distorted, useless. But one showed the lantern clearly, its light revealing the skeletal figure holding it. I haven't been back to Red Feather Lakes, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I see a flicker of light in the distance, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. My name is Clara Reed, and I'm 29 years old. This happened in August of 2022 during a solo RV camping trip to Mesa Verde National Park in Colorado. I was researching cliff dwellings for a book I've been writing about Native American history. What I found there was something no one could ever prepare for, something that still haunts me every day. I arrived at Mesa Verde late in the afternoon. The sunlight cast long shadows across the cliffs, illuminating the ancient dwellings carved into the rock. I'd been here before, but this time was different. I wasn't sticking to the tourist paths. I had maps and notes that led me to a lesser-known area, a secluded alcove where few ventured. After parking my RV at a remote campsite, I gathered my gear and started hiking. The air smelled of dry earth and pine, and the silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of my boots on the rocky trail. This was my happy place, or at least it used to be. A few hours in, I met a fellow camper. His name was Owen Porter, a man in his mid-30s with sunburned skin and a jittery demeanor. He seemed off, like he hadn't slept in days. "You camping nearby?" I asked. He nodded, fiddling with something in his hands. "Yeah, not too far. Found this earlier." He held up a small figurine, intricately carved from dark wood. It depicted a humanoid figure with elongated limbs and hollow eyes. "It's interesting," I said, feeling uneasy. "It's more than interesting," he muttered. "It's powerful. I've been having these dreams. Visions. It's like it's trying to show me something." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded politely. Owen tucked the figurine into his pack and walked off, mumbling to himself. I couldn't shake the weird feeling he left behind. That night, things got strange. I was sitting by my campfire reviewing my notes when I noticed my flashlight flickering. Annoyed, I tapped it a few times, but the beam refused to stabilize. Finally, I gave up and turned it off. As the fire crackled, I heard something, a faint whisper, like wind through the trees. But there was no wind. I froze, listening. The whispering grew louder, distinct words in a language I couldn't understand. My skin prickled. I grabbed the flashlight, but when I turned it on, the beam barely cut through the darkness. That's when I saw it. At the edge of the firelight, a shadow flickered. It was humanoid, tall and thin, but its edges were blurry, like smoke or mist. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was my imagination, maybe the result of a long day in the sun, but deep down, I didn't believe that. The next morning, I decided to hike to the alcove. The air felt heavier than usual, like a storm was coming, though the sky was clear. As I approached the ruins, I saw footprints in the dirt, large and deep, heading toward the alcove. They didn't look like any animal tracks I'd seen before, and they stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had vanished into thin air. Inside the alcove, the temperature dropped. The walls were covered in carvings, ancient symbols and figures that seemed to move when I looked at them too long. In the center of the alcove, I found what looked like a shrine. There were offerings, bones, feathers, and small clay bowls filled with ash. I should have left, but I didn't. I took out my notebook and started sketching the carvings. That's when I noticed the shadow again. It flickered in my peripheral vision, just beyond the edge of the alcove, watching me. By the time I got back to my campsite, the sun was setting. Owen's campsite was empty. His tent and gear were still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. On a rock near his tent, I saw the figurine. It was positioned upright, like it had been placed there deliberately. "Hello?" I called out. But there was no answer. I picked up the figurine, and an icy chill ran through me. My vision blurred, and for a moment I thought I saw Owen standing in the ruins, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. Then he was gone, and I was alone again, holding the figurine. I threw it back onto the rock and hurried to my RV. That night, the shadow came back. I woke to the sound of scratching, long, deliberate strokes on the side of the RV. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and peered out the window. Nothing. The scratching stopped, replaced by whispers, soft, insistent, coming from all around me. Then the shadow appeared inside the RV. It didn't have eyes, but I felt its gaze, heavy and suffocating. It stood at the edge of the small living area, its form flickering like a dying flame. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. The mark on my arm, a faint burn I hadn't noticed before, began to throb with pain. The shadow moved closer, reaching out with long, smoke-like fingers. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished, leaving behind a faint smell of charred wood. The next morning, I was desperate to leave. I packed my things and tried to start the RV, but the engine wouldn't turn over. I checked the battery, It was completely drained despite being fully charged the day before. I decided to hike to the nearest ranger station, but every trail I took looped back to my campsite. It was as if the forest was keeping me trapped. Exhausted and terrified, I collapsed near the fire pit, clutching my arm. The mark had grown, dark veins spreading out from the burn like roots. I heard a voice then, soft and familiar. Clara. I looked up, and there was Owen, standing at the edge of the clearing. He looked pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were empty. "You have to return it," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. "Return what?" I asked, but he was already gone. I knew what he meant, the figurine. I grabbed it from his campsite and started back toward the alcove. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, rain pouring down in sheets as thunder rumbled overhead. Inside the alcove, the carvings seemed to glow in the dim light. The figurine felt heavier in my hand, as if it was resisting me. I placed it on the shrine and whispered a shaky apology. The shadow appeared, larger and more solid than before. It loomed over me, its hollow form radiating cold. I tried to back away, but it grabbed my arm and the pain was excruciating. Images flashed in my mind, screaming faces, ancient rituals, a hunger that could never be satisfied. "Take it back," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. "I'm sorry." The shadow froze, then slowly receded, fading into the darkness. The rain stopped, and the alcove was silent. I don't know how I made it back to the RV, but when I did, the engine started on the first try. I drove all night, refusing to look in the mirrors. The mark on my arm faded, but it never disappeared completely. Now, back home, I still hear whispers sometimes, and when I'm alone, I see the shadow flicker in the corner of my vision, waiting. My name is Megan Carter, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in the fall of last year, when my boyfriend Ryan convinced me and a couple of friends to hike the Devil's Playground Trail on Pikes Peak. It was supposed to be a fun weekend of camping and bonding, but it turned into something I can barely talk about without shaking. Something followed us down that mountain, and I don't think it's ever really left. It all started because Ryan, who's 30 and thinks he's some kind of wilderness guru, wanted to show off. He's always been the confident, go-get-'em type, and honestly, that's part of what I love about him. But sometimes, his confidence tips over into arrogance, and it gets us into trouble. This time, it almost got us killed. The idea was simple. A weekend camping trip to Devil's Playground, a spot halfway up Pikes Peak that's famous for its strange rock formations. Allie, my best friend, was thrilled. She's 26 and obsessed with anything supernatural, so the name alone had her packing her tarot cards and sage bundles. Trevor, my 28-year-old brother, tagged along mostly to keep an eye on me. He's always been protective, but his sarcasm made it clear he thought the trip was a bad idea. Ryan had planned everything, or so he claimed. He'd booked a campsite, checked the weather, or said he had, and packed what he called the essentials. We all piled into his truck early Saturday morning, laughing and teasing each other as we wound our way up to the trailhead. The sun was shining, the air was crisp, and for a while, it felt like a perfect getaway. The first few hours of hiking were uneventful, but the higher we climbed, the more unsettled I felt. The trees thinned out, replaced by jagged rocks that seemed to loom over us. The silence was unnerving. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of our boots on the dirt path and the occasional crackle of static on Ryan's walkie-talkie. "Is it always this quiet?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Ryan shrugged. "We're in the high country, not much wildlife up here." Trevor snorted. "Yeah, except for Bigfoot and whatever else Allie thinks is out here." Allie ignored him. her eyes scanning the horizon. "It's not Bigfoot," she said, "but there's something here. I can feel it." Ryan rolled his eyes, but I could tell he was getting irritated. "Let's keep moving. We'll lose the light if we don't pick up the pace." By the time we reached Devil's Playground, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rocks. They looked like frozen figures, kids playing a game of tag that had been interrupted by some terrible force. I shivered, pulling my jacket tighter. "This place is incredible," Allie said, her voice hushed. "Do you guys feel that?" "Feel what?" Ryan asked, annoyed. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. "It's heavy, like the air is pressing down on us." Trevor laughed, but it sounded forced. "It's called altitude sickness, Allie. Maybe sit down before you start seeing ghosts." We set up camp near a cluster of rocks that offered some protection from the wind. Ryan built a fire, and we ate dinner while the sun dipped below the horizon. That's when things started to feel wrong. The silence became oppressive, broken only by the crackling fire. I kept glancing at the rocks, certain they'd shifted position when I wasn't looking. Allie was jittery, her hands trembling as she lit a bundle of sage and waved it around the campsite. "Seriously?" Trevor said, watching her. "What are you trying to do, summon more ghosts?" "It's for protection," Allie snapped. "You should be thanking me." Ryan stood up and stretched. "All right, enough of this. Let's get some sleep. We've got a long hike tomorrow." I didn't sleep. The wind howled through the rocks, carrying faint whispers that I tried to convince myself were just my imagination. Once, I thought I heard a child's laughter, high and clear, but when I sat up and looked around, there was nothing but shadows. By morning, the weather had turned. Dark clouds rolled in, and the temperature plummeted. Ryan, ever the optimist, insisted we press on. "We'll be fine," he said, stuffing his pack. "The storm will blow over." It didn't. As we climbed higher, the wind grew stronger, lashing at us with icy fingers. Allie clutched her sage like a lifeline, muttering under her breath. Trevor's jokes had dried up, and even Ryan was starting to look worried. Then the compass stopped working. "This is weird," Ryan muttered, tapping it. The needle spun aimlessly before coming to a dead stop. At the same moment, Trevor's phone died, and my own battery drained from 80% to nothing in seconds. "Something's messing with us," Allie said, her voice shaking. "I told you this place isn't normal." Ryan opened his mouth to argue, but a sudden flash of lightning cut him off. The strike was so close, I felt the ground tremble beneath my feet. We scrambled for cover, huddling together as the storm raged around us. That's when I saw it. A figure standing among the rocks, just beyond the firelight. It looked like a child, small, with long hair and a pale face, but something about it was wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. "Do you see that?" I whispered, clutching Ryan's arm. "See what?" he snapped, but his voice was strained. Before I could answer, the figure was gone. We decided to head back down the mountain, but the trail was gone. The storm had erased it, or maybe we'd wandered off without realizing it. Ryan tried to lead us, but every path seemed to loop back on itself, bringing us closer to the rocks. "Where the hell are we?" Trevor demanded. "You said you knew this trail." "I do," Ryan shot back, his voice rising. "Something's not right. Just give me a second." "Something's not right," Allie said, her eyes wide. "No kidding. We're being hunted." "By what?" Ryan shouted. "Your imaginary ghosts." "I don't know," Allie yelled, tears streaming down her face. "But it's real, and it's out there." Before anyone could respond, a gust of wind tore through the campsite, scattering our gear. The fire went out, plunging us into darkness. I grabbed Ryan's hand, my heart pounding as the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. The next few hours were a blur of panic and terror. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and I kept hearing my name whispered in a voice that sounded like my mother's. Trevor disappeared for a while, only to stumble back into camp, pale and shaking. "I heard you," he said, staring at Allie. "You were calling me." "I wasn't," she whispered, clutching her sage. "That wasn't me." Ryan finally admitted we were lost. His bravado cracked, and he sank to the ground, his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he said. "I thought I could handle this." "Apologies won't get us off this mountain," Trevor snapped. "We need a plan." Allie took charge, insisting we follow her. She led us away from the rocks, her voice steady as she recited a chant. The whispers faded, but I could still feel the entity watching us, its presence pressing down like a physical weight. By dawn, we stumbled out of the storm and onto the trailhead. The whispers were gone, but the memory of them lingered, heavy and suffocating. We didn't speak as we packed up and drove down the mountain, leaving our gear behind. Ryan hasn't mentioned the trip since. Allie is convinced the spirit attached itself to Trevor, who's been having nightmares and hearing voices ever since. As for me, I can't shake the feeling that we barely escaped. And sometimes late at night I hear laughter in the wind,